it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this, our distinguished lecture for the college. It's an opportunity in these lectures to hear from someone who's experienced something a bit different, doing something a bit different, and to shed light on their career and how that's developed. And tonight's speaker epitomises that. We're delighted to welcome Professor David Phillips. He's going to tell us a little bit about his career, as you can see there. So I shouldn't probably preempt him with telling you too much about it already, but it does feature global travel and a career that began, at least its academic part, as you can see on the title there, here at the University of Birmingham, where he's a 2 times graduate as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate doctoral researcher. So it's great to have you back, and you've come prepared to give live demonstrations, and we have some brave members of the audience who've taken their lives in their own hands and sat in the front row, or at least had their reserved seats put in front of the experiment. So a particular welcome to you at this stage of the evening. David has had a very distinguished career and continues to be extremely active, as we will hear. It's taken him, as I've said, all around the globe. And I understand some of his academic memories actually involve moving into this building at some point. And that's particularly timely because at some point in the near future we will move from this building and our chemistry will take place in a new building, a building of molecular sciences just adjacent to this place. David's held posts in the US, in Moscow, posts at Southampton, but the bulk of his career was spent at Imperial College, where he was head of school there, head of department, and also moved on to be Dean of the Faculty of Life and Physical Sciences. Among his many distinctions include the first academic appointment given to our current provost, Tim Jones. So he's responsible for our provost, at least the start of his academic career, and we're grateful that you've allowed him to come over to us in Birmingham, or at least he chose to come anyway. Also famous, David, for doing Royal Institution lectures in the 80s and other public engagements on TV, radio, your interest in popularising science and your passion for the state of science in the UK is well known and recognised in so many ways, also through distinctions like an OBE in '99, elevated to a CBE in 11-12, elected to be a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2015 and President of the Royal Society of Chemistry from 2010 to 2012. I won't say anything more, but I think we're set for a fascinating lecture. Over to you, David.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you all very much for attending. I have to say that I found this quite a difficult lecture to prepare because I was asked to talk a bit about my career and the opportunities that came my way and really to sing my own praises. And I have to say I don't do that naturally. So it's a bit of self-indulgence, if you like, for me, this 60 minutes. The title I chose was Light Up Your Life because I'm a photochemist, but I should, instead of saying light up your life, I perhaps should be saying light up my life because that's what I have done over the last 40-odd years. It is exactly 60 years ago, this coming September, that I, amongst several people who are in the audience today, first set foot across the doors of the chemistry department in Birmingham. So Birmingham, when we arrived, had a total of 3,500 students, and only about 5% of any age cohort went to university. So if you managed to get into a university, you were already marked out as being very privileged. And opportunities came your way which didn't to the 95% who didn't make it to university. We now educate something like 45% of any age cohort, so understandably the result of your education at university is going to be different. You are not as special as we were, and we are all very conscious of how privileged we were in those days. The Other things which I don't want to dwell on because it causes angst is the fact that our education was free. Not only were there no fees, that most of us obtained a maintenance grant from our local authorities. And in my case, because my father didn't earn very much, as commonly was the case, we got a reasonably generous living allowance as well. And most importantly, people sought us out after we had graduated for jobs. It was not difficult to find a well-paid employment afterwards. So life is very different, and I hesitate to dwell on it anymore because it is in the distant past now in the UK. So who were the people who had the, I was going to say enviable, but perhaps I should say unenviable task of banging some chemistry into our heads? Well, this is a 1953 slide, so it predates when we came by 5 years, but I'm sure some of my colleagues here would recognise some of the people. In fact, in case you don't, we've identified them, and I thank Jim Burden for these slides. No, actually it was John, wasn't it? John Priest provided the slides. Morris Stacey, who was head of department when we were here. Freddie Pinkard, he was the man who interviewed us in order to allow us to come to this august institution. Gilbert, you probably remember. Jimmy, for those of you who are recent arrivals in Birmingham, just ignore this. I'm addressing these people in the front here. I never knew Walter Wilson, actually, but Sheridan, who went to Bangor as an ESR man. David Whiffen, great fame, went to Newcastle and then to Oxford. Alan Foster, who somebody knows because they they did their PhD with him, and I think probably Jimmy Robb. I'll stop there. Jimmy was special to me for a reason I'll tell you about in just a minute. So who were the people who actually came, the undergraduates? And here we are, a magnificent group of people. This was actually taken in our final year. So we had matured, we were all incredibly competent chemists by then, and this was taken as we left to change the world. For some reason, I'm sitting right in the middle there, and that wasn't planned. But some of our colleagues who we still see and are not here today, Glyn Allen, for example, Derek Broadley, Sam Hirons, who's very ill in Canada now. And this man deserves mention, Jarko Gakovic, a man of incredible talents. We used to have inorganic samples to identify a form of analytical analysis. And Jack used to rub it between his fingers, whatever it was, usually a powder, lick it, and then say what the answer was, and about 99 times out of 100 he was right. You know. So they knew about this, and they decided to get their own back on, and they gave one sample which was red phosphorus, and when he put it on his tongue, he ran a little way. All right. So the people who influenced me particularly amongst the staff at both undergraduate and then particularly postgraduate level were Morris Stacey, who was head of department. He was a man who cared a lot about students, and I think was notable for that. Jimmy Robb, who I said became my co-supervisor of my PhD, and the real supervisor I had was a man called John Major, who ran the mass spectrometry service in the department. He had had a terrible accident in Kodak when he was working in industry, which had left him blind in one eye and not much sight in the other. So he was a very caring man also. I have to say that I did cross swords with both of these gentlemen, never with John Major. In Morris Stacey's case, as we finished and graduated with PhDs, he gave a little speech to say farewell to us all, and he said, sadly, no one of our graduating cohort this year has won a Fulbright scholarship to go to the United States. And I put my timid hand up and I said, you're wrong, I did. And he said, you did? I wasn't an organic chemist, I wasn't a carbohydrate chemist, I was a physical chemist, so I was clearly not counted. Anyway, I did, and I went to the US. Jimmy Robb, I never knew that he was my co-supervisor until we published our first paper, which was typed by Jimmy's typist, and it came back with his name on it. And that was the first inkling I had that he actually had a role in my research. There are the two of them, Jimmy Robb there and Maurice Stacey there. Well, Maurice was a good head of department. Jimmy was a very accomplished reaction kineticist, and he also, and I really want to pay tribute to him, he used to do a celebrated demonstration lecture on light. And he had a technician who was called Wangy Wheeler, and Jim remembers that, and it really was a good lecture. And so later on, when I first started my own lecturing in Southampton, I tried to do a demonstration on every kinetics lecture I gave. There would be one demonstration I would do at the end of the lecture, and very often they had derived from what I'd seen Jimmy do. So I owe him that debt of gratitude, and the reason I got into demonstration lectures outside of the undergraduate teaching in Southampton was that on one occasion we were due to have a schools lecture given by Ron Nyholm from University College, and Ron was taken ill with about 2 hours to go before the lecture, and we had kids being bussed in from all over Hampshire. We couldn't stop that. And so my then head of department, Graham Hills, another wonderful man, said, you do some demonstrations, put together something to entertain these kids when they arrive. So with almost no notice, I did that. And to my astonishment, it was a kind of success. And I've been doing it ever since. And so that's my tribute to Jimmy Robb. Without him, I would not have been able to do that. So, singing my own praises here, my career, I went to local grammar school in the northeast of England, South Shields. I came here for 6 years. I got a Fulbright to go to the University of Texas. And if you look at the date, this was just a few months after John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, and Austin is not a million miles from Dallas. I found it quite uncomfortable because the deep south of the United States has changed a bit now, but not that much. I met more people in Austin who said they only wished they had been able to pull the trigger on John F. Kennedy than expressed any remorse for what had happened. So I didn't feel at home, I have to say, in Austin amongst the community, but the research was fantastic. I was working for the grand old man of photochemistry, W. Albert Noyes, Jr. I'll show him later. Then I went to the Soviet Union. I'll talk about that. I won't say anything about Southampton, except it was a very supportive department to be in, and I was very happy to be there. So when we arrived, and when we were around as undergraduates, this is where this building now stands. Some say that might be an improvement on there. But it was being built whilst we were undergraduates. And so this is what it looked like in its pristine state when it was first opened, which was in 1961. I had to get my kit from the Hills building across to there, and so did a man called Ron Haynes. Do any of you remember Ron Haynes? So we had big vacuum rigs with glassware, and we had to bring it across to this building and then take it in the goods lift up to wherever we happened to be. Unfortunately, I was helping Ron at the time. We got halfway into the goods lift with his kit, and the doors slammed shut and just disintegrated his apparatus, which was really not I've never seen a grown man weep like that. I have since. So we occupied this brand new building, and I can tell you that for the first year of the occupancy, it was in the hands of the contractors. It didn't belong to the university. And so you were not allowed to be in the building after 5 o'clock. So many of us, and I think John might have been amongst these, the window which is just there, before 5 o'clock, we used to open it a little way so that after we'd been to have our meal wherever we'd gone, we'd go back, open the window and climb in and carry on with our experiments. And I gave a seminar here once a few years ago, and Ian Smith was head of department then, and he said to the audience, he said, I want you to take note of this man. He said, here is a man who actually broke into the building in order to do more work. He said, I have to lock the doors on you lot inside to get you to do any work whatsoever. You know. Not true, but there we go. So we had a great time. This is, again, just to remind my colleagues here of what we did. So there am I. There's Rufus Francis Chumley James Moore with a hyphen. He is the only man on graduation whose name took up 2 lines in the graduation. There's Chris Coleman, who's there. That's Neville, I think, is it there? That's George Powers. And we staged a battle on New Street between ancient Brits and Romans. These are the ancient Brits. And in 1961, some of us made a long trip to Yugoslavia, and this was just taken in Salzburg on the way. So we enjoyed ourselves. We had a great time as undergraduates. Some of us did some work, and the results were various, but we all had reckoned on having expanded our knowledge and our experiences. So I went to Texas in 1964. I had been due to go to Rochester in New York to work with this man, W. Albert Noyes Jr., but he had made the transition from Texas. Texas bought him out in order to revitalize the department in the University of Texas. It was an interesting place because it was one of the original land-grant colleges that you may have heard of. In the 1850s, in order to establish state universities in the United States, each state was supposed to give a large grant of agricultural land, which would then provide the finances for the university to thrive. Texas paid lip service to this by granting a huge tranche of desert in western Texas, no agricultural use whatsoever. But it turned out to be a good thing to have done because oil was discovered there, and it became one of the richest state universities in the United States, and still is. So this man, W. Albert Noyes Jr., was a martinet. He had been in the US Army in 1917 in the Argonne on the Western Front. I remember Brian Gowanlock, if we remember him, a lecturer in electrochemistry, told me before I went, he said, if you do not work at least 6.5 days a week for Noyes, you'll be kicked out. I said, ridiculous, nobody works that hard. And he was absolutely right. We used to have our research seminars on a Sunday morning, that was the half day. The rest of the time we were expected to be there. So I realized after a fairly short while that he was in his 60s then, he had worked this way all his life. He wasn't going to change, so I would have to change my spots, and I did the necessary time. And we published a lot of papers. I mean, it was a very productive time. During the time I was there, Noyes was president of the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, and there was a committee meeting held there, and he appointed all of his postdocs and graduate students, one of these delegates, to drive around for a week. And by chance, I happened to get the Russian, who spoke very good English, a man called Kondratiev. He was the deputy director of the Institute for Chemical Physics in Moscow, the director of which was a man called Simonov, some people call him, who was a Nobel Prize-winning kineticist. He got the Nobel jointly with Cyril Hinchelwood from the UK. So I was invited to spend a year in Moscow by this man, and I thought that's a sufficiently off-the-wall thing to do that I would do it, and so I did. And I worked, this was the institute as it then was. It was a palace built by one of the lovers of Catherine the Great in which she could be entertained, but sadly he was out of favour by the time it was finished, so it was never used for that purpose. Became the institute, and I will just tell you a little about what I was doing there. Let's see if the next slide is there. There's Semyonov, remarkable man. This is the man I really worked for, a man called Viktor Yakovlevich Lipintok. Very, very kind man, helped to teach me Russian. This was taken after I had been there. And what we were doing, if I can just show you here, is we were creating free radicals, peroxy radicals, which disproportionated when the two came together and produced a ketone, and it was a sufficiently exothermic reaction that the ketone was in an excited electronic state and gave out chemiluminescence. And what we were trying to do was to establish whether you could stop this ketone dissociating, where it would cause harm and degrade any surrounding medium, and particularly plastics and paints they were interested in, by passing on its energy to a dye. And so we looked at a number of different dyes, and that just shows you some of the fluorescence of those dyes that we did at that time. So I thought you might like to see the modern equivalent of that, and these are just light sticks that anybody can buy. And if I break it and shake it, then you get a very bright light. So there's one for you. That's yellow, is it? There's a red one. There you go. Oops, sorry. Sorry about that. Pink. There we go. Never have a pink one. I'll just get rid of these because I don't want to take them back. Anybody up the top there? There you go. All right. I haven't gone enough. There we are. I talked to that lady up there. So that's exactly what we were doing in these very early experiments in Moscow. But the amount of light we were producing was about 1 billion times less than those are being produced. So we had to work in a basement cellar with no artificial light. So for the 11 months I was there, I was in the basement, never seeing daylight. I was the only Westerner amongst 2,000 workers in that institute, so I became well known. And Kondratiev's daughter was a principal ballerina in the Bolshoi Ballet. And here she is, that's Marina Kondratieva. She actually resembles her father. She's still alive, she still comes to London, although I haven't seen her. And this is her partner in this ballet, is a man called Vasiliev, who was the principal male dancer in the Bolshoi. His wife is this girl here who died last year, sadly, Ekaterina Maximova, and there she is with him, and they were just wonderful dancers. Well, through Marina, I could get tickets to the Bolshoi anytime I wanted, and I saw some wonderful shows there. And there wasn't any language problem because you just were enjoying the dance and the music. But they invited me to a party given by this couple on New Year's Eve in 1966. They celebrate New Year very extensively. I drank far more than I can ever remember, really. But during the evening, I danced, not ballet dancing, but I danced with Maximova and with Marina Kondratieva. And I always have said ever since, there can't be many young scientists around who got to dance with two stars of the Bolshoi Ballet. But it was that kind of experience. I was working quite hard in a fairly junior capacity in an institute, but because of knowing people who were at the top, and also I knew a lot of diplomats, I really had a very privileged life. became very difficult to adjust coming back to the UK, where I was just Joe Bloggs, a lecturer in Southampton. However, the work turned out, we published about 6 papers, I think, in total, coming from 11 months' work. We worked quite hard. And there is the man who left the Soviet Union. That was my exit visa photograph. I didn't know I needed one until I was within 3 hours of getting on the ship to come back from Leningrad. And they hastened me across to the man they called the master. He was the master photographer. He had this very ancient box-like thing, and the exposure was done by simply taking the cap off the lens, counting to 3, and then putting it back on again. But that's the result, which was pretty good. All right. I've been back to Moscow many times since. This is just one of the subsequent occasions. And one which I wanted to share with you, this is a man called Nikolai Kuzmin, and he was a hunter. So I was visiting on this occasion, and you see what these are. These are 3 bearskins, and he shot all of them, not simultaneously, but we took this photograph after we had had a rather sumptuous meal in his flat, and I didn't recognize what we were eating, and I said, you know, what is this? And he said, it's that bear. Eating the bear. Well, that's an uncomfortable experience. Right, so my career really started, I think, when I started in Southampton, and I won't say anything about that because I haven't got time, but it was a very supportive department to be in, and I gave these demonstration lectures which came to the attention of George Porter, who was the director of the Royal Institution, Nobel laureate, and he of course is a photochemist, photophysicist. And so he invited me to be interviewed for a second chair position in the Royal Institution. I just happened to be in the right time, in the right place, with the right credentials. I was a photochemist who could give lectures to school kids. And so I spent 10 years there, mostly very happy. I then moved to Imperial College. I went in 1989 and said I'd give it 5 years, and that was 28 years ago, so there must be something there that kept me there. I was head of department for 10 years, and then dean, and I'm still there now as an emeritus. The Royal Institution was an extremely special place, as you probably are aware. 10 of the chemical elements were discovered in that one building in Albemarle Street in London. Faraday was probably the greatest scientist who ever worked there. He went there as an apprentice to Humphrey Davy. Lady Davy would never treat Faraday other than as a servant. Davy was a bit more enlightened and realized the talents that this man had. In fact, he said towards the end of his life, his greatest discovery, Davy's greatest discovery, was Michael Faraday. So it was a very wonderful place to be. Can you all see that? This is a Gilray cartoon, which I'm very, very fond of. Always reminds me of the RI. This is Humphrey Davy, this rather demonic-looking creature here. This is Benjamin Thompson, Count Runford, who founded the Royal Institution. This is probably Thomas Garnett, who was the chief professor, chemistry professor there. And he is administering laughing gas, nitrous oxide, to this volunteer, so-called, from the audience, with the unfortunate effect that it blew his breeches off. And I just think that's a wonderful description of what was good about the Royal Institution, the hands-on experiments. But somebody who had an enormous influence on my career was George Porter. He had been a very, what shall I say, quite a difficult man in his youth. He was a man in a hurry, but by the time I came across him, he had mellowed enormously and was very helpful. And I took on all of the outreach activities in the Royal Institution at that time. He used to send me as his deputy in various places, and this is a terrible slide, but I want to show it anyway. I went as the British delegate on George's behalf, to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. I bet you didn't know there was a Pontifical Academy of Sciences, but there is. And we were talking about air pollution, atmospheric chemistry. And there is F. Sherwood Rowland, Nobel Prize winner for his work on the ozone layer, upper atmosphere, freons. The only pictures, I took all of these, a whole series of pictures. This one's been copied many times, which is why it doesn't look very good. The only pictures that turned out inside the Vatican, you were not allowed to use flash, were the ones which had the Pope in them. It's also the only conference I've ever been to where nobody left the conference before we'd actually had this celebration at the end. And this man is interesting. His name is Ovchinnikov. He ran a biological institute in Moscow, which is credited with working on biological warfare items for the Soviet Union. And he died rather mysteriously, very young. He was only in his 40s when he died, and possible he poisoned himself. Anyway, so I have been interested for a long time in photochemistry in action, and these are just some of the things that were clearly involve photochemistry. And I'm not going to talk about any of those, in fact, but for the fact that I give a lecture which is based on light and one particular application. So why light? Well, light is a very convenient form of energy. Let's just have a look. This is a little solar device made by BP, and it will work with a very small torch. We'll use a blunderbuss here. Here we go. Very powerful light source. If you put it on, can you see it's whizzing round and round? So the only energy going into that system is the light. And if I put the light out, it will stop working, as you can see. Very easy to make light. Here is a toy that you can probably all seen and used and bought. That's it. Just a radio frequency discharge through a gas which produces this luminescence. Not very impressive, but I just want to show you that if I put my finger on it, can you see the stripe going to my finger is much brighter than the others? And it's because I'm acting as an electrical earth for this device. So the electric current is going down through my arm and into the ground, which tells you, of course, it can't be a very strong current because otherwise I wouldn't be here. And if you want further proof of that, here's just an ordinary fluorescent light tube. And if I put it even near there, can you see it lights up? So again, I'm acting as an earth, the current is going down through me. And if you want final proof, if I just use half the tube, only half the tube lights out. I'm earthing it halfway down. Right? So it's very easy to make light. And light is a very convenient form of energy to get into a system. So I do these demonstrations all over the place. And I want to talk first about applications in the medical field. And I really have not much time, so I'm going to confine myself to that. So photomedicine, as it's called, really has its origins with this, with a gentleman called Niels Finsen, who was a Danish physician. And he made the observation, and this is a lesson for all of us, that people who had tuberculosis in that time, it was very common because there weren't any antibiotics, seemed to suffer these terrible facial sores that they got through the TB, much more in the winter months than in the summer months. And so he reasoned that maybe light was curing the sores, not curing the TB, but the sores. So he got himself a patient, and he got himself a newly available carbon arc lamp, which I have simulated here. So here's my patient with terrible facial sores. Here's the arc lamp, and that singeing experience is pretty much what happened to the patient, really. He gave the patient third-degree burns and did not cure the sores. But he then thought, well, what had he been doing? He'd been putting the full arc onto the face of the patient, and most of the light in there is infrared. It's just heat. And you can get rid of infrared radiation just by passing the light through water. You may know already that the principal greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is not carbon dioxide, it's water vapor. So he had a vessel full of water, put the light on the face of the patient again, presumably a different patient who didn't volunteer again. And this time, partial success. He didn't cure the sores, but he didn't burn the patient. So then he thought, should I give up at this point? No. It could be the ultraviolet light, which is important. And glass does not transmit ultraviolet light. So he got a quartz vessel, put the water in, and this time success. And you can see this is his real patient. There are the sores, so the model wasn't too silly. There's what happened afterwards. The scabs dried up and fell off, and she has a normal face for a while. So, there are many, many other examples of photomedicine which I could tell you about, but I'm not going to because I haven't got time. I just want to mention some of the things that we have done. PDT, photodynamic therapy, is the injection of a dye into the bloodstream which locates preferentially in tumor tissue, so you get some selectivity for tumor tissue. You turn on, in this case, a red laser. Well, why red? And if I shine it through flesh, can you see that the red penetrates? Whereas if I shine the green one through, you get nothing at all. So if you want to get light into the body, you have to use red light. So you inject the dye, improbably, the tumor in this case has been located in the leg. It's usually an internal organ. You then direct red laser light. You produce an excited state. So the molecules which work are plate-like molecules like thalassines, porphyrins. You produce singlet oxygen. This is the conventional mechanism, which then destroy the cells around, the tumor cells. If the dye is only in the tumor cells, you only destroy the tumor. And you also turn on apoptosis, which is tumor cell suicide, so you amplify the effect that way. Well, does it work? Yes, it does. Here is a tumor under the tongue, which is pretty horrible. This is treated using exactly that technique of injecting a dye and then using red light. This is 3 weeks afterwards. There's some regeneration of tissue there now. And 6 months afterwards, perfectly normal tissue. The alternative to this is pretty brutal surgery. And so this really is an advantage. There are 3 forms of skin cancer which you can treat. Basal cell does not usually metastasize, it stays local, but it will grow. Squamous cell, jury's out on that, whether it metastasizes, but it still can give you a pretty nasty carcinoma. This is deadly. This is melanoma, which will spread through the body within weeks of you developing this. And you will then usually die of a secondary tumor somewhere else. So here is a patient, a Russian lady, as it happens. Has a basal cell carcinoma. It will get bigger, but it will not spread to other parts of the body, but has to be treated. Surgery would remove a lot of that and leave her permanently disfigured. PDT achieved that using these dyes that we developed simultaneously with some of the Russians. These are aluminium thalassine dyes. And you see that she's perfectly clear. There's not even any scar tissue there. This is just to make the men wince a little. To get light into the body, you use an endoscope, and this is a gastroscope. It goes down your throat as far down as your duodenum. If Neville can be my patient here, hold it over your head so you can see it. So now it's inserted in your stomach down there, and now I can turn it in any direction I want to look around corners, all right? But that's used, of course, to observe inside, but now you can just use a high-powered laser to fire down there and carry out the treatment that you need, not invasively, because you're not, it's not an operation. So, I'm going to run out of time. So here's a man who's got a bladder cancer, so he's got a smaller version of that endoscope inserted, well, you know where. That's the before and after. That's a tumour on the wall of his bladder. This is afterwards. It's now all dead tissue and will just slough away and be excreted in the normal way. And so pleased is he with the result of this experiment. He's looking down the tube into his own bladder, and he has got a smile on his face. We were trying, a lot of the work we've done in the last 10 years has been trying to improve the efficiency of this PDT process. And so approaches to achieving targeting, we can't really improve on the photochemistry because it's already efficient enough, but we could improve on the targeting. And we have used monoclonal antibody fragments, MAFs, to target some target on a tumour which is not on normal tissue. And I'm just going to quickly go through. This is a HER2 target. Here's what the conjugate actually looks like that we inject. This is the monoclonal antibody fragment, and these are porphyrin molecules that we've attached. Have great advantages over a free dye. And just to show you it works, these are subcutaneous tumours where we've tried with a free dye to arrest the growth of the tumour, and it works for a little while and then it still grows. With our targeted system, you eradicate the tumour completely. So this tumour not only is eradicated, it never grows again. Fluorescence has become of enormous importance, as you all know, and so I'm just going to show you a few dyes here that fluoresce strongly. This is a coumarin, this is a rhodamine. I won't put the lights up because we haven't got time. This one's interesting. It's colourless, so it does not absorb visible light. It does absorb ultraviolet light, and you always get fluorescence just to the red of where it absorbs. So just to the red of this, the ultraviolet is the blue, and so you get a nice blue fluorescence from it. And another thing that does that, which at this stage in the proceedings I need, is ordinary tonic water, which has quinine bisulfate in it. Quinine has a quantum yield of fluorescence of about 0.55. It's strongly fluorescent. And there it is. Now, I could be cheating, couldn't I? So I'm going to drink this, but if you'll forgive me, I'm going to add to it a substance which is not fluorescent, but is necessary for well-being, perhaps. So your very good health, and here's to the success of this department. Cheers. I once gave a presentation along these lines 3 times in a row in Imperial, and I don't cheat, this is for real. And at the end of the 3 presentations, I had no idea what I was talking about. So I'd like to finish with one thing, one more demonstration, if you can bear it. This is my nephew, as he was when he was a few days old. I have to say he's 33 now, so it's a very old slide. But what he has is jaundice. He's got neonatal jaundice, which is caused by bilirubin in the blood, a breakdown product of red blood cells, which is bright yellow and is fat soluble. It dissolves in fat and not in water. You've got a lot of fat just under your skin, that's where it goes. We lose it enzymatically. We develop an enzyme, we don't have it when we're born, which converts the bilirubin into a water-soluble form. So if you're born prematurely or with any liver malfunction, you don't develop this enzyme quickly enough. You get a lot of bilirubin in your bloodstream, gets into your skin, and ultimately is very dangerous. In the central nervous system, it can kill you. So it was discovered by accident that if you irradiate this baby with blue light, then you will convert the bilirubin into a water-soluble form. And I thought it would be nice to finish with one of the demonstrations which has become my kind of stock in trade, my my trademark, if you like. This is a glass baby that has in his legs an authentic sample of bilirubin in a simulated fat solution. It's actually chloroform. And I want to show you that he can't excrete this, so I've got to give him a drink. And he drinks through his mouth, as you all do, but without complaint, I have to say. I'm going to move that over because I want to catch anything I spill on the tray. There we go. So talk amongst yourselves for about 1 minute. Right. So if I hold him up, you should be able to see, I hope, some of it's gone because I haven't been very clever, but most of the yellow colour is still in the legs. There's a little bit gone into the water layer on top. But to make it water soluble, I simply have to irradiate with ultraviolet light, blue light actually, in a hospital, and that should make it water soluble. What we're actually achieving is a cis-trans isomerization reaction of the bilirubin, which is folded in on itself in a normal way, but it has double bonds. If you isomerize around one of those double bonds, you open the molecule out so that carboxylic acid groups are presented to the water layer, and that makes it water soluble. Now, that may or may not work, but we'll try and see. What I have to do now, I wouldn't dare do in the United States. I've got to shake him violently. And I probably haven't irradiated long enough, but I hope you'll be able to see that. Well, it's not separating. Why is it separating? When it does, some of the yellow colour will have gone into the legs. I normally have to irradiate for longer than that. I've also used a much stronger bilirubin solution than I should have done. But anyway, if you can believe that normally what happens is all the yellow colour goes into the water layer, and this rather well-endowed young man can now do exactly what nature intended and what you do. So the treatment for neonatal jaundice is a kind of very familiar form of photomedicine. So, what have been the career highlights of my career? Well, the Faraday Award of the Royal Society for Public Understanding of Science. I was president of the RSC for 2 years. I was elected to fellowship of the Royal Society in 2015. I was awarded, because of the Faraday, I got the OB, and because of the presidency of the Royal Society of Chemistry, I got CBE, and I was a guest on Desert Island Discs and on Radio 3 Private Passions. And I was listening to a lecture a couple of weeks ago about Grayson Perry. You know Grayson Perry, the potter? And it was said that from a very improbable start, he could now be considered a pillar of the society because he was a fellow of the Royal Academy. Well, I'm a fellow of the Royal Society. He had a CBE. Well, I have a CBE. And he had appeared on Desert Island Discs, and so have I. So by that token, improbably, my colleagues will say, I have become a pillar of society, which I still find hard to come to terms with. That's just to show that we like to dress up when we can. This is the Royal Society of Chemistry annual party. And that's my dear wife Caroline, who has been a great support all my life. Pay tribute to her. That's me signing the Royal Society book, and what's so moving about that is there's only one book. Every fellow of the Royal Society, since the beginning, since Hooke, has signed that self-same book. And so, until Paul Nurse's time, Paul Nurse, of course, a Birmingham graduate as well, we used to have to use a quill pen to sign this, but it caused so much angst and grief that he insisted that from now on we use a fountain pen, so I got to use a fountain pen instead. You meet all sorts of people in this sort of guise. This was the 90th birthday parade on the Mall last year, and there's a lady who remembered that I had insulted her when she visited Imperial College. I was asked to explain to her what research was going on in a particular room. And she said, halfway through, she said, "There's no need to treat me like an idiot, you know. I do understand these things." So I then upped a gear, and she didn't understand anything. This I'm really proud of. This is Buckingham Palace, lunch, May 2016. Only 8 guests. Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen, and I'm there somewhere. Where am I? There. And I was sitting next to, this man is the so-called, he's a vet on Channel 4. Super vet, yeah. Yeah. She spent a lot of time talking to him about corgis. This was a lecture I gave in Berlin. It's probably the biggest public lecture I've ever given. It's in the Technical University Berlin, and there were more than 1,000 people in the audience. And I felt very proud. This is the ambassador to Germany, and we actually stayed overnight in his house, which I thought was very nice. So, all I'd like to say is, I don't like showing off, but I think I probably can be said to have had a successful career. Success brings with it interesting things. This is my CBE. That's Tom Welton, who's the faculty principal in Imperial College at the moment, also on the council of the RSC. So it's a tale which I'm happy to share with you. I think I came from an extremely humble, not very distinguished background in the northeast of England. When I first came to Birmingham, I spent about 6 months of total mutual incomprehension. I could not understand the Birmingham accent, and they could not understand the Geordie accent, which I then had. It was a very productive time here, very enjoyable time here, not least because I made some good friends who've lasted 60 years, and some of them are here today. But the message I really want to leave with the younger audience is this. What is my advice to you? What can I tell you to do? Do something you're interested in. Money is not everything. Don't go and work in the city if you don't like that sort of thing, but you want the money. Do something which truly stimulates you. Be opportunistic. Seize chances. Just don't think too much about what it might mean. Do it. Don't always take the safe option. Be stoical about research. It doesn't always work out. So you've got to keep at it and still keep your spirits up. Above all, enjoy life and be lucky. So the principal thing is, I seem to have made something of a success of my life. So can any one of you. Just do what you want to do and do it well. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Well, good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm John Priest. I'm the current head of the School of Chemistry, and I've got the privilege tonight of actually giving the vote of thanks and chairing the question and answer session. So first of all, I am going to give the vote of thanks, and so I'll give you time to think about your questions you might want to ask David. But the first thing I'm thankful about, and I'm not sure this quite is in keeping with the vote of thanks, is I'm thankful I wasn't head of school when you guys were here. Given that you were breaking in through windows, giving red phosphorus to colleagues, I'm extremely thankful that I had head of school, because health and safety doesn't seem to
Health and
have been...
safety was rather different in those days.
I trust David about health assessments for these experiments and stuff before he came here. Right, so I think we knew we'd be in for a treat tonight, given David was not only a past president of the RSC, but also a Royal Institution Christmas lecturer. I think we just put that into perspective. Other Christmas lecturers include the physicist Carl Sagan, the naturalist David Attenborough, and even Edward Franklin, who a building is named after the road, one of the great chemists. So really, David is one of the true pioneers of modern chemistry, I would say. He's in great company in the list of those Royal Institution lecturers. Indeed, David, as you know, was also on Desert Island Disc, and if you haven't listen to that, it's worth going to the Radio 4 website and actually having a listen. Look for Prof. David Phillips, not Professor. if you like Prof first, otherwise you find other professors. It's quite hard to find you initially. Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah, it's Prof David Phillips if you want to look for you. So I certainly haven't been disappointed tonight, and don't think any of you will have. I think we've all learned a great deal from David's scientific and life experiences, which have been delivered in such an engaging way, both using gin and tonic and a peeing glass boy. I think all of us will be left with material to reflect upon, whether it's that is how to do science, or more importantly, to have the courage to take opportunities, and not to be scared of taking the not so well-trodden path. I think that's a key thing for me from listening to you tonight, David. So I'd like to take this opportunity to also thank David for his much wider contributions to the community of chemistry and scientific scholars, and all his efforts in making science more accessible to the public through all his outreach activities, which have been numerous through the years. Clearly starting here when he was at the University of Birmingham, being forced by Rob to do that. If it were not for people like David, who care passionately about science and stand up and lead on behalf of the many, then the world would be a much poorer place. I think we can all agree. So David, can I thank you for spending time with us today, for the lecture you've just given, for engaging with this lecture with a number of EPS students in the roundtable discussion, which was really very, very enjoyable. I hope the students will agree. And finally, thank you for your leadership roles throughout your life, and ultimately thank you for being such an inspirational alumni, and tonight lighting up our lives. Thank you.
Just say in return that this is a great university, and may I wish you all the very best for the future. It is a fantastic place.
Thank you. Right. Questions for David?
If you're talking about people I met who were alive, then I would have to say George Porter. I think he just was a very accomplished man. He knew a lot about music, about literature, fantastic chemist, and just for me a very supportive person to work with. I don't say for, because in fact we had separate research groups there. So he would be one that stands out. But I think also Albert Noyes, who taught me a lot about what I needed to do in order to make any progress in research, to apply myself, if you like, and that was a good lesson. And he was not a very demonstrative man, but I found out much later that the reason I was appointed to Southampton, where they hadn't even seen me, was that he had been making a visit to Paris. His wife was French, and of his own volition got himself to Southampton and effectively took the interview for me and told them that they must appoint me, which they duly did. And I never knew that. He didn't tell me that until 10 years afterwards that I found that out. Not from him, from somebody else. So he was a gentleman. It's a good question. I think if you force people into doing a subject which they're not really interested in, you will just cause misery. So we've got to somehow release in students that enthusiasm for the subject. And I think you can only do it by example. I've lectured in places, in schools, particularly in the East End of London, where we do a lot of outreach from Imperial, where almost the first question they will ask you is, how much do you earn and what are your job prospects? And I say, if you're asking that question, don't become a scientist. You know, that's not why you become a scientist. You can, if you're lucky, earn a lot of money, but actually you should be asking different questions. So I think you have to, you can engage them young, and I think that's one of the secrets that we've come across. I instituted in the Royal Institution lectures for primary school children, and they were enormously successful. I mean, the enthusiasm those kids have for any knowledge, but science included, is unbounded. They seem to lose it around about puberty or early teens, and we've got somehow to find a way of getting over that. You'll not have any problem with kids who are already predisposed towards science. You can just encourage, reinforce their already existing opinions. It's the others where we do have a difficult task. So I don't think there's any panacea. You can't just say we have to do this and it will work. You just have to keep trying and hope that along the way some of the people you engage with will go into science.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Can you please join me in thanking David once again for what's been an absolutely splendid evening.